This is the Chapter 6, Section 2 video called Maximizing in the Marketplace. And we might start out by asking a question. So if households and individuals in society are going through life maximizing utility, and firms are going through their business maximizing profits, is that good for society? In other words, if it's true that individuals behave like economists assume, and they maximize, is that good or bad for society as a whole? Well, it turns out there's an economist who is discussed here in the textbook, and I have a picture of him for you, named Adam Smith. And he's considered the father of economics. He lived from 1723 to 1790. And in 1776, he published one of the most important books in economics called The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations asked the question, one way to describe the wealth of nations is what determines why some nations are rich and other nations are poor. And so that question is still as timely today, over 200 years later, as it was in 1776. Now, I think it's an interesting coincidence that this book was published in 1776. What other important document do you know that was written in 1776? The Declaration of Independence. And so you might say that the founding document of democratic institutions and the founding book in economics, which advocates for free markets, were published in the same year. And indeed, Adam Smith did advocate for free markets, not completely unfettered free markets. He didn't say we should have zero government intervention, but generally he did believe that markets were good. And there's a very important idea associated with Adam Smith, and that is the pursuit of self-interest in a marketplace would promote the general interest. So I asked at the beginning of this lecture, is it good that individuals and firms are maximizing? Adam Smith said yes. Because if individuals pursue their own self-interest, it will turn out to be good for society. And so here's a flavor of why that is. You may have picked up a bagel and a coffee when you came to school this morning. Why was that bagel and coffee there for you? Was it because, did the baker wake up at 4 in the morning to bake your bagel and make your coffee because they wanted to do something good for society? No, they wanted to make a profit, right? So they woke up at 4 in the morning, baked these bagels to make a profit. But as a result, that was good for you because you wanted a bagel and you found one at a fair price, so society is better off. That's the flavor of it. In other words, when individuals pursue their self-interest, society as a whole is better off. This is, Adam Smith said, individuals would be guided as if by an invisible hand. And so this is an important term that is associated with Adam Smith, and it describes the way in which markets guide decision makers into socially productive activities, even though the individuals themselves may not care about being socially, beneficial. They only care about their own self-interest. So we're going to talk about the extent to which markets are efficient. We'll see that generally, if two conditions are met, namely that markets are competitive and property rights are well established, then the free market outcome will generally be efficient. So when will the free market be efficient? There are a few conditions that if they hold, the free market outcome will be efficient. The first is markets are competitive. The second is property rights are well defined, and we'll talk about property rights next. A third is there are no external effects, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. So there are a few characteristics that must hold, but if they do hold, markets will yield efficient outcomes for society. So with respect to property rights, here it's important to define two characteristics of property rights that are required for markets to achieve efficient allocation of resources. The first is, property rights have to be exclusive. And another term I sometimes see associated with this concept is, and I think it's a better term, so you get right to the point, excludability. So excludability means you have the right to exclude other people from using your property. So some of you have a bottle of water in front of you. I'm not allowed to just go and take your water, right? Because you have a property right to your water, you can exclude me from using it. Another characteristic of property rights is that they're transferable. Because if they're transferable, you can sell your whatever it is that you have a right to, maybe a piece of land. And so we want resources to be traded so that the people who know how to use them best will get them. And so if property rights aren't transferable, that won't be possible. Okay, so we say that markets are efficient when the net benefits of all economic activities are maximized. And we saw in the last video that when marginal benefit and marginal cost intersect, net benefits are maximized. Net benefits are maximized here at this quantity. If we consumed a smaller quantity, like let's say we consumed instead, let's say we exchanged instead this quantity here, then net benefits would not be maximized, right? Because total benefits minus total costs, or net benefits, would be just this area here. But instead, if we chose a different quantity to exchange, namely this quantity here, then net benefits would be this larger area and would include this little triangle here. And so if we're consuming this quantity Q prime, we're not maximizing net benefits. It's an inefficient situation, and as before, the deadweight loss, this black triangle here, quantifies the extent of the inefficiency. Now, we'll talk about producer and consumer surplus. This is a really important concept, so please pay attention. The consumer surplus is defined as the amount by which the total benefits to consumers from consuming a good exceed their total expenditures on a good. And so let me give you an example. Let's say you're really hungry, you really want a bagel. This morning you're really hungry, you want a bagel, and you're willing to pay $5 for a bagel. You get to the store and you found the bagel only cost $1. Do you buy it? Yes, right? And you're happy, right? Because you bought it for less than you were willing to pay. And so you get a consumer surplus of 4. You're willing to pay 5, you only have to pay 1, so therefore your consumer surplus is 4. That's how you think about it for an individual. For a whole market full of consumers, imagine we have this demand curve. So you were willing to pay a high price for a bagel, $5. Other people were only willing to pay $3 or a little bit less, right? And still other people were willing to pay more, maybe $7, right? So the demand curve shows how much people are willing to pay, right? Or in other words, how much they value the good. We can describe how much you value the good by how much you're willing to pay for it. And so let's say the price is 1. It turns out this area is consumer surplus, this whole area. So if you just want to know how to identify consumer surplus on a graph, I would put it this way. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. And so we see that here. Let's say the price is B. Or here's the price. This is the price. What is the total benefit that consumers receive? Well, first of all, what quantity do they purchase? The answer is E. So they're purchasing this quantity. The total benefit we know is the area under the demand curve up to the quantity. So this whole area is total benefit. right? Some people were willing to pay a lot for the bagels. They got a big benefit. Some people were willing to pay a little bit less. They still get a big benefit. And the people who were just willing to pay the price got this benefit. And so we add it all up. This area is the total benefit. But you had to pay for these, right? The consumers had to pay for these. And this illustrates how much they had to pay for them. In other words, this rectangle is total expenditure. If you subtract the two, you get this triangle, and this is consumer surplus. So in other words, what I wrote on the last slide was that consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price, right? So that's that light blue triangle. On the other hand, what about producer surplus? Well, the producers, the consumers are spending this quantity, right? And we can even put some numbers on here to make it a little more realistic. Let's say the quantity is 100 and the price is 5. So how much are consumers spending? 5 times 100 or 500, right? So this would be 500. So the consumers are spending $500 on these bagels. The producers receive that, right? And this is called total revenue, right? Just because it's just the expenditures from the consumers go to the producers, and that's we call revenue once they get it. So this is their total revenue. Now, how much did it cost them to produce these 100 bagels? Well, we know that the total cost is the area under the supply curve. And so therefore, producer surplus is the difference between the two, this light sort of pink triangle. Well, let me tell you how to identify producer surplus on a graph. Producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. So I've told you how to identify consumer surplus. It's the area below the demand curve and above the price. And I told you how to identify producer surplus. It's the area below the price and above the supply curve. And why are these areas important? Well, this is, for consumers, the benefit that they receive, the net benefit that they receive, right? Total benefit minus cost. And this is the net benefit that producers receive. It's the total benefit, which is the total revenue, minus the cost. And so we can add them together, producer surplus plus consumer surplus, and we get net benefits for all market participants. In other words, putting consumer surplus and producer surplus together, this shows us the net benefits for society as a whole. But it's divided into the areas of consumer surplus and producer surplus for the buyers and the sellers. And so producer surplus and consumer surplus are really important ways in which we can measure efficiency in the supply and demand model. So we can say, for example, is a certain policy like minimum wage laws, is that efficient? Well, if total surplus, that's consumer surplus plus producer surplus, is not maximized, then the policy is inefficient. And so economists, when we're asked to evaluate policies like minimum wage, we're concerned with efficiency. Our models tell us whether policies are efficient or inefficient. But people out there in the world don't only care about efficiency. So for example, politicians and other policymakers also care about equity. And our economic models don't really have a big role for equity. In other words, we emphasize efficiency, not equity. And so, remember at the beginning of the semester I asked you to think inside the box with respect to using these models to evaluate policies. And so when you do that, you'll assess the efficiency of the policies. But then when you want to say, is the policy good or bad, you have to take off your model hat right? And look at it in terms of other things that people care about, including equity and fairness and justice and all these other things. So why don't we look at, now that we've developed these tools of consumer surplus and producer surplus, let's look at an example of a policy and analyze it with these tools. Let's return to our example of minimum wage laws. So it's just a, I'm going to try to do this a little bit better. Let's return to our example of minimum wage laws. So one more try. Let's return to our example of minimum wage laws. We have a demand and supply, and this is the market for unskilled labor. So we have a quantity of labor. This is the price, and in labor markets we call the price a wage. And so normally, if this was a free market, like Adam Smith advocated, the equilibrium would be here. The quantity exchanged might be 100, so this might mean there's 100 jobs, and the wage rate might be, say, $5 an hour. Is this efficient? The answer is yes. How do you know that? Well, imagine we didn't have 100 jobs. Imagine we had 110 jobs. What's the marginal benefit of the 110th job? It's given by the demand curve. So the marginal benefit of a 110th job is like $4. What's the marginal cost? Maybe $6. So it doesn't make sense to use a resource when it costs more than it's worth, right? When the costs of using it are bigger than the benefits. Likewise, what about a smaller quantity? Let's say we had 90 workers. Well, there, the benefit of that worker is like $6, and the cost is only $4. This is the opportunity cost of the worker, is $4. The benefit in terms of how much this worker can produce for the firm is $6. So then that's good, right? But it means we're not consuming enough. So I've claimed and tried to demonstrate why 100 is the efficient quantity. But let's look at it in terms of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So the wage, $5, seems to some people to be unfair or unjust or inequitable. And this is the reason why we have proposals for minimum wages. Right? And so let's say we have a minimum wage of, say, $8. We know that the quantity exchanged will be here, maybe 70. The quantity supplied is going to be larger, right? Like maybe 130. And the difference between the two, this, we called before, what? Excess supply or surplus. But I don't want to talk about the surplus right now. Let's just focus on assessing the efficiency of this policy. What is the area of consumer surplus? And by the way, who are the consumers here? Households or firms? Firms. So we're going to call them consumers here because they're buying labor. What is the consumer surplus? It's a triangle, and remember, it's the area below the demand curve and above the price. So this triangle here is consumer surplus. What about the producer surplus? Well, the producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve for those units that are exchanged, right? And so this is the producer surplus. So the producer surplus looks like it got bigger, right? maybe. The consumer surplus definitely got smaller. But we also have this white area that nobody gets. This represents the inefficiency of the policy. And what do we call that? This white triangle is the dead weight loss. All right, and so this is why we say that minimum wage laws are inefficient, because it results in a fall in net benefits, in a reduction of total surplus. But some people, even if they agree that minimum wages are inefficient, still think we should have them, because notice what happens is we transfer consumer surplus from the firms to the workers. Right? Like, it's particular. The consumer surplus before the minimum wage was this whole triangle, right? This whole area was consumer surplus before. Now it's smaller, it's just this green area. So this bit here was transferred from firms to households. In other words, from consumers to producers. It's true that they lost this area. Nobody gets this. But most of it goes to producers, the workers. And so some might say, look, it's not efficient, but it's more equitable, because the firms, those are the rich people, and the workers, these are the poor people, and so we're transferring net benefits from one group to the other. Do you buy that argument? Do you find that to be a compelling justification for minimum wage laws? If you agree that minimum wage laws are inefficient, do you agree that there's a reason for minimum wage on grounds of equity? Well, you might want to think about it. Economists would say there may be better ways to help low-income people. For example, we could just transfer income to them. And so if the deadweight loss, it turns out there is a deadweight loss of taxation, as we'll see later. If that's smaller than the deadweight loss in this market, that would be better. So let prices adjust on their own in a free market. But then we'll transfer money to low-income people, and that might be a more efficient way to help low-income people. Another thought is, who owns firms in a modern capitalist society? Does Scrooge McDuck own all the firms? He owns maybe some of them. But a lot of, you guys don't know who Scrooge McDuck is. That was before your time. This DuckTales is the cartoon I'm referring to. In a modern capitalist economy, most large firms are publicly traded. Right? That means the firms are owned by the shareholders. And who are shareholders? You, me, our parents. In other words, the firms, the consumers in this market, are owned by the households. And so economists tend to be a little bit agnostic when we evaluate, is consumer surplus or producer surplus more important? We tend to be agnostic and say they're both equally important. Because in this market, you might say, it's the firms, but the firms are owned by the households anyway, right? And so we evaluate markets in terms of total surplus, treating consumer surplus and producer surplus equally.